I typed the message 4 different ways before I finally sent it. Sitting in my car outside my own apartment, hands a little unsteady on the phone. Can you come over tonight? Just you. Please don't tell Sage I asked. I read it over twice, deleted the please, put it back, deleted a different word, and finally hit send before I could talk myself out of it entirely. The text was to Renata, Sage's mother, a woman I'd known for 6 years now. Ever since Sage and I met in a college lecture hall, neither of us particularly wanted to be in, and became best friends over shared notes and complaints about the professor. Renata had folded me into her family somewhere around year 2 of that friendship, the way some mothers do with their kids' closest friends, feeding me on holidays, remembering my birthday, treating me most of the time like a second son who happened to just live somewhere else. 6 years of friendship with Sage had turned, somewhere along the way, into something else entirely, though it had taken both of us embarrassingly long to admit it out loud. We'd been officially together for a little over a year now, a relationship built on a foundation so solid it barely felt like a transition at all, just a natural next step in something that had always, in hindsight, been heading exactly there. And for the past 2 months, I'd been planning to propose, carrying a ring around in increasingly creative hiding spots, waiting for the right moment, and needing, more than anything, Renata's help to actually pull it off properly. My phone buzzed almost immediately. On my way. 15 minutes. Should I be worried? Not worried, I wrote back. Good news, actually. I'll explain when you get here. Sage was out for the evening. A standing Thursday dinner with her college roommates that ran reliably late, which was the entire reason I'd chosen tonight to finally set this plan in motion. I paced my apartment for the better part of 10 minutes, running through what I wanted to say, rehearsing it the way I'd apparently rehearsed most of the important conversations of my life, and I was still mid-pace when the knock came at my door, 10 minutes after my last text, Renata clearly having driven faster than 15 minutes technically allowed. She stood on my doorstep in a cardigan thrown hastily over what looked like pajamas, hair pulled back, an expression of barely contained curiosity mixed with real concern. Okay, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, the same easy familiarity she'd always had with my apartment, treating it in a lot of ways like a second home for her too, given how often Sage and I had hosted family dinners there over the years. You texted me not to tell my own daughter I was coming to see her boyfriend at 10 o'clock at night. I need you to understand how many terrifying possibilities I imagined on the drive over. I'm sorry, I said. I know it sounded ominous. It's actually the opposite of ominous, I promise. Then tell me, quickly. My imagination has already planned 3 funerals and 1 very awkward confession. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small velvet box I'd been carrying around for the better part of 2 months, and watched Renata's entire face transform the instant she saw it. Her hand flying to her mouth, whatever version of the conversation she'd braced herself for on the drive over immediately replaced by this one. Oh, she said, muffled behind her hand. Oh, thank goodness. I thought, never mind what I thought. Is that what I think it is? It's exactly what you think it is, I said. I want to ask Sage to marry me, and I wanted to ask you first, both for your blessing and because I need your help pulling it off, because I've been planning this for 2 months and I can't figure out how to make it feel like her, instead of just some generic proposal I saw in a movie somewhere. Renata sat down heavily on my couch, still staring at the ring box like she needed a moment to fully process that this was actually happening, and I sat across from her, suddenly nervous in a completely different way than I'd been nervous about the proposal itself. I've been waiting for this text for probably 3 years, she said finally, laughing a little at herself, wiping quickly at her eyes. Not this exact text, obviously, the don't tell her part gave me a genuine scare, but some version of this conversation. I always knew you two would end up here eventually. I just didn't know when. You're not surprised? Sweetheart, I've watched the 2 of you together since you were 19 years old, arguing over lecture notes in my kitchen. I've had a very long time to see this coming. The only surprise is that it took you an extra year after you two finally admitted you were together to actually get here. In my defense, I wanted to make sure I did it right. Sage deserves something that actually means something, not just a ring and a restaurant and a string quartet nobody asked for. That's exactly why I'm not surprised it's you asking, Renata said, reaching over and squeezing my hand. Something warm and genuinely emotional in her expression now that the initial shock had settled. So, tell me your plan. And I'll tell you honestly whether it sounds like her or not, because I promise you, I know that girl better than almost anyone alive, and I will absolutely tell you if you're about to make a mistake. I walked her through what I had so far. A plan built around the community garden where Sage and I had actually first properly fallen for each other, years into our friendship. The summer we'd both signed up for garden plots on a whim and ended up spending most evenings there together instead of anywhere else. I wanted to propose there at sunset, with something quiet and personal instead of a big public spectacle, which Sage had always claimed she'd hate. Renata listened carefully, nodding along, and then shook her head slightly at the end. "It's close," she said, "but it's missing something. Sage is sentimental about that garden, yes, but the thing she's actually sentimental about isn't the location itself, it's what happened there. Do you remember the specific night you're thinking of? Or are you thinking of the garden in general?" "General, mostly." "Why? Is there a specific night?" "There absolutely is," Renata said, leaning forward, warming immediately to the task in a way that told me I'd made exactly the right choice bringing her in on this. She told me about it years ago, practically glowing when she described it, and I don't think she has any idea I remember the exact details, because she mentioned it exactly once and never brought it up again, the way you do with things that matter too much to talk about casually. She told me the story then, one I'd half forgotten myself, an evening early in our friendship, long before either of us had let ourselves think of the other as anything more, when a sudden summer storm had caught us both at the garden with no shelter nearby, and we'd huddled together under the narrow overhang of the tool shed, soaked and laughing, waiting out the rain, and at some point during that hour, Sage had apparently told Renata she'd looked over at me and thought, with real clarity for the first time, that she might be in trouble, might be feeling something for her best friend that complicated everything, and had spent the rest of that summer quietly terrified of what that meant. "She's never told me that story," I said, genuinely stunned. "I remember that storm. I had no idea it meant anything like that to her." "That's exactly why it should be the moment," Renata said. "Not the garden in general. That specific tool shed, that specific spot, on an evening as close as you can manage to recreating the feeling of it, even without an actual storm to force the issue. That's the moment that actually matters to her, even if she's never told you directly." We spent the next 2 hours working through the details together, Renata contributing pieces of Sage's history I hadn't known, small preferences and memories collected over a lifetime of being her mother that added texture and specificity to what had started as a good but somewhat generic plan. She told me about Sage's favorite flowers, which weren't roses, despite what I'd assumed, but the modest, unglamorous marigolds that had been the first thing Sage successfully grew in her very first garden plot as a teenager. A plant she still, to this day, grew a row of every single summer without ever quite explaining why. "She won't tell you why either, probably," Renata said. "But I'll tell you, since apparently I'm your accomplice tonight. Her grandmother grew marigolds. She passed when Sage was 12, and Sage has grown a row of them every single year since, as a way of keeping something of her close. She's never said it out loud to me either, but I know my daughter well enough to know exactly what those flowers mean, even if she thinks she's kept it private." I sat there, taking in details about the woman I loved that I hadn't known despite 6 years of friendship and a year of dating, feeling a strange, grateful humility at how much more there still was to learn, and how lucky I was to have someone like Renata willing to fill in the gaps with such obvious love for both of us. "This is exactly what I needed," I said. "I would never have found any of this on my own, not in time anyway." "That's what mothers are for," Renata said, smiling. "Even the mothers of the person you're marrying, apparently. I'm happy to help. More than happy, honestly. This is easily the best part of my week, possibly my year." We settled on a plan by the time she left, close to midnight. I would arrange to bring Sage to the garden the following Saturday evening under the pretense of a normal dinner date, weather permitting, with the actual proposal happening at the tool shed where the whole thing had apparently started for her, years earlier than either of us had properly noticed, surrounded by a small, careful arrangement of marigolds I'd need Renata's help sourcing on short notice, since it wasn't quite the season, for the ones Sage usually grew herself. "One more thing," Renata said, pausing at my door before she left, some of her earlier lightness giving way to something more serious. "Are you sure about this?" "Genuinely sure. I mean, not just caught up in the momentum of planning something exciting. Because I love you like a son, And I love my daughter more than anything in this world. And I need to know you're doing this because you're certain, not because it felt like the expected next step. I'm certain, I said, without any hesitation at all. I've been certain for a long time, honestly. Longer than I probably should have waited to act on it. Sage is the best thing that's ever happened to me, and I don't want to spend another day of my life not making that official. Renata's eyes went glassy again, and she pulled me into a hug, tight and genuine, the kind of hug that felt like an actual blessing instead of just words. Then welcome to the family properly, she said, pulling back, wiping at her eyes one more time. Not that you weren't already family in every way that mattered, but properly, officially, on paper. I couldn't be happier about it. The following Saturday arrived with almost unbearable slowness. Every day of that week stretching out longer than it had any right to, my nerves building steadily as the plan Renata and I had built together moved closer to actually happening. She'd come through on every detail, sourcing a small, careful arrangement of marigolds from a specialty grower 2 towns over, coordinating quietly with the garden's management to make sure the tool shed area would be free of other visitors that evening, and checking in with me twice through the week with the kind of steady, calming reassurance that made the whole plan feel less terrifying with each conversation. I picked Sage up that evening under the same casual pretense I'd used a dozen times before, a dinner date, nothing unusual, and suggested a walk through the garden first since the weather had turned unexpectedly pleasant, warm with just enough of a breeze to feel like summer instead of the encroaching edge of fall. She agreed easily, no suspicion at all in her expression, and we walked the familiar paths together, past our old adjoining plots, now tended by other gardeners, toward the tool shed at the far edge of the property that neither of us had visited together in years. "Why here?" she asked, as we approached the narrow overhang, genuine curiosity in her voice rather than any hint of suspicion. "We haven't come to this spot in ages." "I wanted to," I said, my heart hammering hard enough that I was fairly certain she could hear it. "There's a specific reason, actually. Do you remember the storm? The one from our second summer with the garden plots, when we got caught out here with no shelter and had to wait it out right under this exact overhang?" Her expression shifted, surprise and something softer moving across her face. "I remember it," she said slowly. "I didn't realize you remembered it that specifically." "I didn't, honestly, not until recently," I admitted. "Your mother reminded me, told me something about that night I didn't know, actually, something you apparently told her a long time ago and never mentioned to me." Sage's eyes went wide, understanding beginning to dawn even before I finished the sentence. "She told you about that? About what I said to her that summer?" "She did. And I have to say, learning that you'd already figured out something like that about your own feelings, that far back while I was still years away from admitting anything to myself, made me feel like the slowest person alive." "You weren't slow," she said, laughing, though her eyes had gone glassy. "You were exactly as scared as I was. We were both just very good at pretending otherwise." I reached into my jacket pocket, pulling out the small velvet box, and watched her entire expression change the instant she registered what it was, her hand flying to her mouth in an almost exact echo of her mother's reaction the week before. "I've loved you since long before either of us admitted it," I said, kneeling down beside the small arrangement of marigolds I'd set up earlier that evening, close enough to the exact spot where she'd apparently first realized her own feelings, all those years ago, under a very different kind of rain. "I loved you as my best friend for years before I ever let myself think of you as anything more. And I've loved you as more for the past year in a way that's only gotten stronger every single day since. I don't want to spend another day of my life not making it official. Sage, will you marry me?" She was crying by the time I finished, nodding before she'd even fully found her voice, dropping to her knees in front of me instead of waiting for me to stand, pulling me into a hug so fierce it nearly knocked us both over onto the garden path. "Yes," she said, finally, laughing and crying at once, pulling back just enough to look at me properly. "Yes, obviously yes, though I have several questions about how exactly my mother ended up involved in all of this." "She was instrumental, actually," I admitted, sliding the ring onto her finger with hands that weren't quite steady. "I texted her last week and asked her to come over without telling you. She showed up at my door about 10 minutes later looking absolutely terrified, convinced I was about to deliver terrible news. That sounds exactly like her, Sage said, laughing properly now, looking down at the ring, then back up at the marigolds arranged carefully around us. And these, you knew about the marigolds too. Your mother told me everything. About your grandmother, about what this flower means to you. I wanted tonight to actually be about you specifically, not just some generic proposal. I wanted it to feel like something only the two of us, and apparently your mother, could have put together. It's perfect, she said, kissing me, unhurried. Right there on the garden path in the fading evening light, surrounded by the flowers that had meant more to her than she'd ever let on. At the exact spot where she'd first realized years earlier exactly what she was feeling for her best friend. We called Renata the moment we got back to the car, and she picked up on the first ring, clearly having been waiting anxiously by the phone the entire evening. Well? She said, before either of us had said a word. She said yes, I told her, and I could hear Renata's happy shriek clearly enough that Sage laughed from the passenger seat beside me, shaking her head fondly. I knew it, Renata said. I knew the marigolds would do it. Oh, I'm so happy, I could cry. I think I am crying, actually. Give me a moment. Mom, Sage said, leaning over toward the phone. You knew about this? You were in on it the whole time. Your fiancé texted me exactly 1 week ago and asked me to come over without telling you, Renata said, still audibly emotional. Best secret I've ever kept in my entire life. And let me tell you, it was not easy. I nearly told you 3 separate times this week, just out of pure excitement. We got married the following spring, a small outdoor ceremony held, fittingly, at the community garden where the whole thing had started years earlier, under an overhang during an unexpected storm neither of us had planned for. Renata gave a toast at the reception that had half the guests in tears, recounting the story of the secret text, the frantic 10-minute drive, the marigolds, and the proposal itself with the pride of someone who considered the whole thing at least partially her own accomplishment, which, in fairness, it very much was. I always tell people, she said, raising her glass, looking between the two of us with an expression of pure, unfiltered joy, that the best proposal is the one that actually sounds like the person receiving it, not some generic idea of romance from a movie. I'm just glad I got to help make sure that's exactly what my daughter got. 10 minutes after that text came in, I was standing on his doorstep, terrified out of my mind about what I might find. I never could have guessed it would turn out to be the best night of my entire year. I raised my glass along with everyone else, looking over at Sage, who was watching her mother with an expression of overwhelming love and gratitude, and thought about how a single careful text, sent nervously from a car outside my own apartment, had set off exactly the right chain of events, pulling in the one person who knew Sage well enough to help me get every detail right, and ending, months later, in exactly the future I'd been quietly hoping for since long before I ever let myself admit it out loud.